Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Tomas Ocampo, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today, we will be discussing the main theme of the September LAP issue, the Resurgence of Collective Memory, Truth, and Justice Mobilizations, Part 2, Artistic and Cultural Resistance, with editor Roberta Violon, a Fulbright Scholar, Associate Professor, and Chairperson of Sociology and Anthropology at St. John's University. Roberta is also affiliated with the Committee in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Originally from Argentina, she has studied the political sociology of structural and interpersonal violence, intersecting social inequalities and social movements, focusing on Latin America and Latin American immigrants as an activist researcher. Author of Violence Against Latina Immigrants, Citizenship, Inequality, and Community, she is also the editor of our first part of the Resurgence of Collective Memory, Truth, and Justice Mobilizations issue from May 2015. Good morning, Roberta. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Pleasure to be here.
Roberta, for my first question, can you briefly summarize for our readers the main themes that the issue covers?
Of course, this second part of the special issue on collective memory, truth, and justice focuses specifically on how different groups in Latin America have developed artistic and cultural means to keep memory alive related to human rights abuses during military regimes and civil conflicts that occurred at the end of last century. We look into the ways in which communities have tried to keep their claims in terms of reaching some sort of justice, mostly related to processes that had either been addressed at some point through the justice system, but then curtailed in different ways, as well as processes that were never addressed at all. So for example, in cases in countries where process of truth, justice, and reconciliation didn't begin or started, but then were shut off, and in other countries where even if these processes happened, didn't really reach all of the populations or communities that were affected by the violence.
In the introduction, we're sort of presented with the idea that art and cultural works sort of challenge atrocities and we can say restore the humanity of citizens and communities. And in looking at some of the journal's articles, to what extent are cultural and artistic works able to humanize horror, so to speak, and what might limit them?
That's a great question, right? Clearly, for the authors of these articles, the artistic and cultural creations that they're looking into had a certain degree of success, right? Now, relatively speaking, success can be measured differently. So one of the points that I try to make in the introduction is that there are several ways in which artistic creations and cultural spaces or creations have become useful for these long-term processes of memory, truth, and justice. And artistic creations and cultural spaces have become means of bearing witness, have tried to humanize horror and its victims in a way that would allow people to understand the violence or try to get a better sense of how and why violence occurred. They try to bring some kind of rationalization in a very metaphorical way. So it's like a complement to logic through emotions that at the same time helps rationalizing what happened, encouraging as well reflection, discussion. It's very thought-provoking, these artistic and cultural means. They have allowed for remembrance to either research or emerge at the first time. They have also served the purpose of expressing dissent and challenging versions of the events that may be misleading or may be partial, bringing another version of what had happened. And they have also fostered the conscientization of violence, human rights abuses, and injustices during and after the conflict. And this is very important because per se, an artistic creation or a cultural space for remembrance is not trying necessarily to solve something, but they are a critical part of this long-term process of making sure that there is a recognition of the violence that occurred, that there is a recognition of processes that are still open, that there are still open wounds because there's not been a fair resolution depending on who's looking into it, right, or who are the victims or the survivors related to it. So going back to the point whether there have been limitations to these processes, of course, given that all what's been conceptualized as labors of memory, right, the efforts that communities have put forth in order to address these issues related with human rights abuses and extreme violence. The limitations have to do with the fact that these processes are highly complex and they are always partial. Right? There are different people presenting their truths to what occurred. The way in which, for instance, artistic creations or the building of cultural spaces will always have a certain subjectivity to them. Therefore, there's always going to be some selection of what facts are presented, some selection of whose memories are to be respected, some partial version basically of what's happened. And then if we piece all of this together, we can get a more comprehensive, right, understanding of the process as a whole and its different versions, the different perspectives, the different ways in which people and their communities have endured the processes, the different ways in which they're raising their claims, how they're conceptualizing justice, what they consider to be actually the true version, right? How, and even if, right, even the idea or the question whether it's actually possible to reach a certain point of reconciliation and to put an end, right? Say, well, let's say that at this moment, now onwards, we can say we have solved this issue, right?
Right. And in looking at maybe something current, I'm not sure if you're aware, but recently, a few, I think, weeks ago, the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo completed their 2000th demonstration. So I thought that it was interesting that we are still dealing with some of these challenges to remembering like these movements and how they have evolved from their beginning and how they continue to change and how the narrative continues to change.
Absolutely, like the example of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo is not a paradigmatic, right, example, given that they were in some way a pioneer of these movements very early on, and they have kept, right, their movement alive for several years, despite all kinds of efforts from, let's say, the top down to put an end to this process of memory, truth, and justice. Now, this collection, right, it's the second part of what's going to be a three-part special issue. The argument that I've made or we've been making is that we have been witnessing a second wave in these movements for memory, truth, and justice in Latin America. And this second wave have certain characteristics different from the first one that occurred at the very beginning, right, when these conflicts or the military regimes or the civil conflicts were still occurring, right, and people were trying to put an end to this. And there were the first moments after the return to democracy or the signing of peace accords. There's this first wave of trying to understand what had happened, of trying to bring justice, especially for those who had been unfairly, right, treated, who had been disappeared, murdered, etc. This first wave was very strong, was very significant, especially in some countries in Latin America, not all, but in several of these countries. And there was a moment where this wave kind of became, let's say, more moderate, not disappear, but became more moderate, partly because of government efforts to put an end to these processes of, let's say, looking back and trying to claim justice. Also efforts from part of the government to, let's say, appease civil society and let's say put the military to rest, or those who had been part of the civil conflict to say, well, let's stop the fight and let's move forward. Now, the process of memory, truth, and justice that occur at this very early stage, in most cases, if not all, were very unsatisfactory, right? They were not, they were partial. They achieved a certain degree, let's say, of memory, truth, and justice, but not all. And most people involved in the early mobilizations were very dissatisfied with it. And eventually they started mobilizing again to say, well, we have to go back and look to see what occurred. So the second wave of memory, truth, and justice has been very important. It started with the turn of the century, and part of this process, the second wave, was the reevaluation of the first memory, truth, and justice processes. Also, they provided new interpretations of past violence. The first interpretations were, let's say, more black and white, right? When the ones who were guilty and the ones who were the perpetrators and the victims. It was like a very kind of maybe an oversimplification of what had occurred. And also there was this second wave have brought richer memories of what occurred. So, for example, groups that were originally thought of as simply perpetrators of violence started to raise their voices and say, well, we were also victims, for example, right? Or
Right.
groups that were excluded from the process of memory, truth, and justice started to say, well, we also were part of this in different ways, and we also think we deserve, right, to be recognized as part of the conflict and to be recognized in our claims. So the second wave had also the characteristic that we've been trying to reflect in the collection of articles of this special issue, that it was developed in more countries, right? So the first wave was mostly concentrated in the southern cone of Latin America. Now the second wave is much more spread. So for instance, we have, besides Argentina and Chile, which were like the main countries that had gone through this process of memory, truth, and justice, we have Uruguay and Brazil and Bolivia and Peru and countries from Central America going through, including Colombia, for instance, as well, like going through this process of memory, truth, and justice. So it's a more comprehensive, more complex process, and that's what we're trying to bring into the issues.
Well, I think you mentioned that it's still very complex, and there's a lot of nuance that we still have to deal with and unpack. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for providing us with very insightful answers and in kind of a perspective into this area of Latin America.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for being here with us, Roberta, and thank you to our audience for listening in. Please don't forget to add us on all of our social media, so Facebook, Twitter, and now Pinterest. Please join us again in November when we conduct our next podcast.